Hello, everyone, and welcome to Keen on Architecture, the Modern Masters via watercolor as our media of choice. This session will be dedicated to sketching within roughly hour-long video sequences where you draw along and follow through the very fast type of media that has some particular nuances to it that we have to address right away. Number one is we're going to be working with not only a drawing type of utensil, in this case, a brush that could put media down on it, but we're doing it through nature herself and water, which makes it a little tricky in terms of learning the first steps for it. But you'll see that once you understand the process, it's a faster process than the other ones we've done to date, pencil, design markers, things like that. So I'm going to walk you through the steps here, just introduction wise, in terms of content. And then we'll do a little bit of diagramming with the media itself so you get a sense for the aspects of it. So in terms of the content of the next 10 session series, we're looking at the modern masters. We're going to talk about the oldest one, who Frank Lloyd Wright had a career and reflecting on that, became one of the four modern masters and is about a half generation older than his peers at the time. So we'll start with the Darwin Martin house out in Buffalo, New York, as representative of one of his prairie homes, and then we'll move to one of his Usonian homes, this being the Affleck house in Michigan. Then we'll move to Walter Gropius, who once Wright had established himself as a very early modernist. Matter of fact, he was doing modern architecture before the modern movement. Walter Gropius then creates a school of architecture and design in Dessau in Germany, pre-World War II, in between the wars. And at the Bauhaus, we'll see the language of his architecture have a formative view of the future of what is installed for the rest of the century. And then paralleling to that, even though not considered an actual modern master, but singularly the Stijl house by Rietveld in Holland is at this exact same time and decade as the Bauhaus. So we'll take a quick look at that. And then we'll move over to the Swiss-French modern master, Le Corbusier, originally known as Charles Jeanneret, changed his name to Le Corbusier. So he too could be an object type. So that if the house itself becomes an object type as machine to live in, much like a brush is something to paint with, a house is something to live in. So technologically, it should have more of a symbol of the features of its utility. So Charles becomes the Corbusier, or the designer of things in sense. So we'll look at the Villa Savoy first from 1929, and then the second part of his fourth career at Ronchamp, where he has four major phases of his career as a modern master. This out in the southeast corner of France near the Swiss border. And then we'll look at a German architect, Mies van der Rohe, who also right on the same time as Villa Savoy creates, down in 1929 for the World's Fair, the Barcelona Pavilion, which got rebuilt after its 1 year up as a fair module. It became so successful and sort of a relic of the 20th century that they rebuilt it in the 80s back in Barcelona, so it's now a permanent exhibit. And with that sort of nothingness of architecture and detail, he then masters in Chicago as he transfers from the Bauhaus to Chicago School of Design, which eventually becomes the Illinois Institute of Architecture, the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And then that creates with his firm the idea of the skyscraper growing taller and taller with easier and easier methods of steel and glass. So at 860 Lakeshore Drive, we'll work with that period piece by Mies van der Rohe. So those are the four modern masters, and then we'll end with two more contemporary versions of late modern architecture. We'll look at Frank Gehry at the Bilbao Museum, and then at the Aliyev Design Museum, we'll look at Zaha Hadid. So those are the 10 principal aspects we'll look at through the course of the 20th into the 21st century of modern language, and we'll approach that through a drawing language of brush and water. So the key aspect here is you'll have access to these line drawings here, which I sort of pre-screened for you. And you simply can't print and draw on the Xerox paper stock because it's not a paper that can take water. So it only has a bond ratio of maybe 60 pounds. And so the paper would barely absorb the water. When it did, it would saturate it. You wouldn't have much of a media play on it. So there are papers designed specifically for watercolor. So what I'm suggesting is 140 pound. So I'll make the note down here in the corner. Oops, right down here. 140 pound, and then cold press. There's hot press, which gives you more of a terrain in the paper. And it's got more peaks and valleys in the actual construction of the paper. The cold press then flattens it out and makes it a smoother type thing, which is more preferable for kind of the modernist architecture we're going to be drawing, where it's sleek and linear. So look for 140 pound cold press and buy a packet of that for at least 10, if not 12 sheets of just about the same size we always use, close to 11 by 17. So 12 by 16, 12 by 18, 11 by 17, 140 pound cold press watercolor paper. That way it can take the water here and absorb it into it. And then once the water's in the paper, you can add pigment to that, or you can bring pigment with the water, and we'll go through some of the basics of the types of washes we'll do to build out the ideas here. So now back to the media. Obviously, we brought these before. You'll need cups and probably a series of small cups, and obviously they'll be filled with water. And you'll mix in some, and then as you mix in, you may keep using that mix of water on your background or for the skin of the building, and so you'll keep those for an integral for the part of the drawing there. Then you always have one clear cup of water just to wash and clean out your brush in between your moves. So you always just start with a fresh brush and not bring other colors from the site into, for instance, a new site that might be a different tone completely. It's not that big of a problem for architecture because architecture kind of melds colors together, and it's all kind of natural, particularly in the language of Wright, which we'll start with in our first journey. But it is a tricky medium, and there's going to be some experiential things you'll go through if you haven't tried this before. And then with that, you'll need to have different types of brushes. And when we get to the paint stocks, you'll see sometimes when they sell you the paints, they'll sell you one pointed, small tipped brush that comes with the set. So you need that for sure for all your detail. It's for some of your preliminary mixing just to trial things out. And if the drawing's very, very small, you'll use a lot of time on that. But then because architecture is oftentimes rectilinear, we want 2 flat brushes minimum. And the more brushes you have, the more possibilities you've got and the ease it is. But for a lower end budget, I suggest a 1/2 inch flat and then about a 3/4 inch to inch flat. And that's for broad brush washes of background greens or sky blues and things. Or if you want to make the whole paper wet and then drop paint into it so the water paints the painting rather than you pushing along with the brush. And we'll talk about those wet on wet types of washes too later on. So that's kind of the bare minimum to get your water, your cups, your brushes, and then finally the actual paints themselves. And so iconically, there are always sets of things that are predetermined and preset out there for beginners, and that's probably where most of us are going to be. So you can find a good brand in terms of the color stock. This is Fine Tech, or you could find other ones like that, kind of a stereotypical offering where it opens up and you get a series of 12 colors. With those 12 colors, you can probably mix any other color that your imagination can dream up or what you're drawing from. So that's enough as a base, but don't get too much smaller than a pack of 12 because it forces you to have to mix more and blend more between colors to find the match you want. And then the tray on the side over here is really do your mixing, if it's a small mix or a larger mix. So you bring water over to the mixing tray, and then periodically you'll clean that out so that it's nice and sharp and white and dry for future sketches. Now, if that isn't the to your price point there's other models out there which are more like ideally smaller, and they're travel kits. Here's one that's been opened and used already, where in this case, you buy the base kit that might have 8 colors and you add pads. So if you want to get direct pads related to the architectural scenography, you can buy them pad at a time and build out your kit. zone by zone there in terms of your greens and your blues and your ochres, because architecture is really sort of an earthen type of art form. And so in this, it gets you sort of the array that you could do graphic design and powerful colors, which are really rarely seen in architecture in their sort of ideal form here. So you tend to blend them, maybe bring some of the green into the ultramarine blue to cut down the severity of the blue itself. So blending and mixing the colors is important. So the kits can be smaller. You can work instead of circular pads with little square pads, and they're interchangeable that way. And so the one that I work through mostly is a large set like that, so that I've got the whole array of that. And so that'll be more expensive. This is the Winsor Newton brand, which is a strong brand coming from London. There's a lot of great ones from the European continent, the Germans. Japanese sets are out there. American brand, Cotman is a good brand as well. So your price point will determine the types of pads you're allowed or the quality of the brushes you get. So you get what you pay for in terms of watercolor sets. And these also come in sets of 3 as starter sets of brushes. Again, the types of bristles up here get finer and more expensive. You'll know the price point. A 1 inch of extraordinary fine hair on it might be as much as $20, $25. This whole set was probably $7 or $8 total. So again, buy towards your budget for these introductory types of drawings we're going to be doing. So I'll keep the Winsor Newton open over here on the one side. You can see me kind of work through that a little bit. Or maybe I'll do it on the top and get it out of the way so I can mix up here. And I'll keep the water over here and secondary mixing bowls over on the side. And now all we want to do is move towards our initial sketch we've had for other media in the past, and that is working with the idea of how to do a 3-dimensional piece of design architecture out there and put it on a 2-dimensional plane. So back to the cube we go. And in this case, the line drawings that were done that you'll work for in the series of Modern Masters were drawn with a technical pen. Technical pen typically means you should really read the stock on here to make sure you've got what you're looking for. Is it's going to have permanent ink. So this is a multiple language. It's a German brand, Statler. I'm using the 0.3 because that's a decent line weight. It can go all the way to a half of a point right here. And then 3 is kind of a mid-grade. And I think the thickest stock they sell is probably close to a 7 or 8. I collect a 5 as well. But for these series of drawings, I'm only going to use a 3. Maybe when we're done and the drawings all dried up, we can use some thicker line weight or finer line weight if you want to add more definitive value to the final sketch. So because it was architectonic in the modern language, I actually used a drafting triangle to then take the original. Let's go back to the Martin House that you'll have printed out 11 by 17 through Xerox. And again, you can't watercolor on that Xerox paper, so you have to transfer that. So you'll go onto a light table and place that 11 by 17 on the light table, and then put your watercolor paper on top of that. So the light will shine through, and you're simply going to draft those same lines in with the number 3 point technical pen. And each one's going to take, 5 to 10 minutes to get those base lines down. Don't worry about getting all the lines down. It's just a matter of trying to set up so we have a base of where the information is going to go. And then we can add more detail as time allows and interest level goes in terms of developing the sketch over the course of the hour. So that's kind of a base setup where you're going to have to work 10 times on the base units, or maybe per day, do one right before you actually do the drawing and do the draw along film. But in this case, what we're going to do is just freehand it. And we're going to assume at the base of our sheet of paper here beneath our platen of colors, we'll establish our horizon line. And then we know from all the drawings you've done to date with Canon architecture that there's a certain amount of the building that's above the horizon line. So we assume, again, like our other previous introduction drawings, that about halfway up that first floor level is our eye height. We'll draw that individual there. So there's scale to the site. And now, since we're using permanent ink here, when we do hit this sheet of paper with water, this won't bleed out. So if you're using a temporary ink, a flare, a cheaper type of pen that doesn't say, it's got to say permanent ink on it, it will wash out and become blurry. So this will hold its fine line quality through all the watercolor and painting we'll do in a little bit. So now we put our key corner here, the part of the lily that's closer to us. So that's about a halfway point, so the double height of a person, so 12 and 12, 24 feet high. And then we're going to simply reference it so that we look at it where the left side is more in light and broader, and the right side is trailing back quicker, which means the left point's further away and the right point is closer. So we'll take this back to this point, over to that point to find those vanishing lines, and then back to the right point, and the right point over here. And then because we can see great particular geometries in perspective here, we can tell how to make almost a cubic space. It's a little bit taller than it is wide over on this side. Drop that down, and then it seems like it's a full square and then maybe a half going back away. So find what looks like a full square to you coming down, and then half of that more. And so now we've drawn this wooden block in perspective. And again, as we know, if we change the points and move them to the left or the right, inside together, further apart, what we're doing is simply rotating our vantage point of how we're seeing the view of the box itself. Even if you'd like to drop it down beneath the horizon line where you'll see the top of it, that would actually keep the points here. Your horizon line stays up and the box drops down or up on a hill above you. All depends on where your eye height is, or from the camera angle, which we work from in terms of our view shed here. Okay, so now if you've gone and stopped the film, or else you've already previewed this film, want to come back and draw along with me, what we're going to do is talk about different types of wash technique before we actually try to articulate this at all. And there are 4 simple ones, and then probably an infinite number of in-between ways. But to see the 4, we're simply going to do 4 little swatches of area we're going to draw into with the paint. And just use quick little terms that this is going to be dry on dry, and then dry on wet, and then wet on dry, and wet on wet. So all we're really talking about is the paint that you're using as you apply it, is it water-based and the water is dominant and the water has a tone to it? Or is it just the least bit amount of water to make the pad here liquid? So it really is more of a dry type of paint that's going onto the paper directly. So let's start with a simple tone up top here. Use a little bit of water, and let's say we'll go to sort of an ashen red from a prior project here. It's in the pad. And just barely liquefy it. So the brush point is mostly just color itself and very little water. So when you put this on here, it's almost like the same as a design marker where you're getting full color across there, and it's fairly easy to control. It's almost like using something that's coming out of a pen point, because the paper's dry, so when it hits the paper, it stays exactly where you put it, and so it's a nice, quick, solid. Now, look at the difference is we'll come over to our water here, the one that's going to be the place where we wash it. So now the base is all very clean. And now we go to a clear pond of water, since that's now tainted with that. And now we're putting just water on the brush. Put it in view here for you. So now it's just water. I'm going to fill this next one and make it all wet first. So now the paper is trying to absorb the water. So what's interesting about this drawing technique is that time is of the essence, because you have to control what you know the water is going to want to do. It's going to stay wet, but within a series of minutes, this is going to go back to being paper dry again. So you've lost the potential of that water. But while it's on here, we'll see what it does by now coming back to the exact thing we did the first one through and get, again, a dry brush, which is mostly just paint. And now we're going to apply it to a wet paper stock. So you can see what the paper does is it takes it around and moves it to where the water is. And so you can get more effect and more movement here. And we'll see later when we're actually in a sketch down the road where you can actually lift the paper up and let gravity take the water down along the top sheet of the paper. And so you can come back into one corner with the dry, and you can heavy up certain areas of it just with the paint and let the water kind of dissipate the language of what's happening on the paper. So it's not just you brushing it, it's where the nature of water takes the pigment itself. Now, if we come over to a very sloppy version, so let's say, for instance, and tip this over for you, if we come over to the paint area and say on this zone over here, it's mostly water that dominates the brush, and yet there'll be a tone to it because I'm adding color to the water. So now the brush head is very sloppy with tone to it. Then coming to here, when the paper is dry, it's going to be a faster movement. Instead of taking multiple strokes, it's a very simple way to get a nice, quick effect of a tone on the skin. Whereas this, we're pushing the media and we have to make strokes to fill up the areas if it was a pencil point or a marker point. In this case, the water takes it and makes it uniform right away. So for instance, if we dried out this pen a little, brush tip a little bit, and then come back to this, and now the brush is dry, we'd actually take the pigment out if we like it a little bit less, because that'll be absorptive now and take the pigment out, so we can control just how much as the media changes there. And of course, the last thing is when you kind of merge the two wets together. So we'll come back to our pure white and simply soak our little square. Corner to corner. And while I'm doing this corner here, waiting for it to kind of set up, because it takes a second for it to actually get into the actual fibers of this. Let me describe what's happening here kind of on a microscopic level. If we flip the paper up and look at its cross section, typically we think of paper as just a line deep. But if we kind of blow that up and assume that's the thickness of the paper, so now we've really blown it up probably 1,000%, 10 times its normal thickness. When I put the ink on, the ink probably came down there, got absorbed, and kind of went that deep into the paper. So basically a wash might move right beyond it. It doesn't know where to stop. If you chose a method different than doing your transfer on a light table, instead of doing a pen, which doesn't really indent the paper, the ink stays on top of the paper. If you did it with a hard lead, this is just a drafting pencil. It's a hard lead because it's in the H zone, and it's probably one of the hardest because it's 6H. So it's almost like a nail. It's such a tough lead that you can really take the same line here and using your, I'll do a double above this line. That was drawn by hand just on top of the paper. If you moved it up and did the same thing up here and you drafted it and you push down and put that line down there really strong, you're actually then taking the point of the pencil and it's doing this to the paper where it's making a cavity. That way, when the water comes on and the brush starts to put the water over here, it'll stop at that line. So you can edge the movement of water more if instead of putting line work on top of the paper, you push down the line inside of it. So you're actually taking the fibers of this and you're compacting them along the way if you draft onto it with the pencil. If you do the ink, it'll still work just as well, but you may have some creep beyond the actual black lines. For our case, a sketch that's fine. For renderings, you tend to want to draft the lines in the beginning and then move your colors into that so you can control the edges more. So that's wet on wet. You can see they're all related here, but they all have subtle differences in terms of how you want to attempt things. So what took us a lot of effort to kind of poche and move through value in the sky and the natural aspects, or maybe light pouring across the skin, we had all this mark making. We'll be able to do sky and nature in a matter of seconds because we're using nature to design nature along the way. And that's the power of watercolor, to give you that kind of effortless view of the world just with a couple of key strokes. And so dry on wet or wet on dry will be really effective to us in terms of controlling the information. So we'll keep this monochromatic in the beginning. We might even do the first drawing in the series in black and white, just to get used to the idea of working with paints first and then mixing colors in the other 9 as we approach the whole list on the modern masters. So one thing we can start with then, we acknowledge that this is the same color wood on all sides. So the 2 sides we see here, we can just assume probably a sloppy wet on dry to start this out. And we can just simply fill that in fairly quickly. Fairly quick. And now the trouble with the watercolor as opposed to other media is you just have a waiting period before you want to, unless you want to put another splash of tone into this, let the water do more work for you. A lot of times this has to set up now and become drier. So you work on other parts of the scheme in the meantime. So for instance, if you want to come into a green base for the lawn out here, we can do the same type of quick wash of wet on dry on a nice tight little sketch here by bringing that pad in perspective off the left vanishing point and over to the right, all the way up to the horizon line. And the same is true then if we want something in the background that's going to be skyborne or something. And this time what we'll do is we'll flip it around. We'll say we're going to make the whole area kind of become darker at the top and then lighter and lighter and lighter on each page right at the base. And that with other media is hard to actually articulate with strokes and points. In this case, the water is going to be ideal for it. So we'll shift to the bigger brush, 3/4 inch, to do, this is a small sketch, so that's probably the largest one we'll use. We'll simply wash the whole backdrop in water first. And the more water you put in over a bigger space, you might be able to see that there's a little bit of a buckling in the paper, and then it'll settle back in flat, but while it's wet, it kind of buckles up a bit. So now this whole back zone here is kind of primed to bring in a nice sort of sloppy blue sky in the backdrop. So let me find some more pigment for that here. It looks like it'll be good. Just do a wet on wet here. And we'll start at the top. Line that up there. And now we'll kind of break that up to the edge of the building. smaller line here in the backdrop coming through over here, and then a really tiny one far away, getting deeper towards that horizon line. So it has a nice effect now in terms of instant cloud and seems more naturalistic than anything we've drawn to date, because we had to manufacture that with a media that really isn't idealistic for sky and cumulus clouds, things like that, and much more natural because the water's got that connectivity to it. Okay, so now as the sky sets up, now this is set up more here, it's almost fully dry. We can then come back in and use some of the blue and establish that we want this side to be sunlit and this side to be less valued. So we're going to come to the corner, and instead of using a darker tone of red, we use the sky then to create the shade side. And then on top of that, we've got the shadow that comes from the sun side and then hits the ground here and goes back in perspective. So I do is quick with a line here. It doesn't come straight out, it comes back on an angle and runs back. So now we're going to do wet on dry, take it back beyond the building, and the last edge of it will be vanishing to our right vanishing point. And then what's nice about it is you can do that as a trial, then you can add more value to it as you like. So now that kind of sits that block down a little bit more. We've got a nice feature and kind of texture to it. You can see the paper gives kind of a patina to the paper, so it's not just brilliant white like Xerox paper. The watercolor paper's kind of got a nice terrain to it, if you will. And now, as the sky sets up and we've got things in the foreground here, you can articulate the architecture, but we'll do a little bit of the natural aspect in the back. So we'll come back to green really quickly. And in this case, because the trees we want to be darker than the grass green, we're going to add a little blue from our sky. And that's how you want to work with color always, is to don't have separate pools that are distinct original colors. You want to blend once or twice with something else, and then use your sky for your shadow work, because that's the cloak that's coming down from above that mixes in. It's not just a deep charcoal color, a deep tone. It's got the color of the ambiance of the atmosphere around it. So if we get a green started here, we can then move back into that backdrop and show the foliage above, and we'll break it right before the horizon line, because we'll come back in and do the value of the trees in a second. And since it's not the subject itself, it's just a support for the architecture, we can bring it to its edge. And it also has that kind of delicate view where it's kind of fading out of our information because it's not finished with the line work up front. And now we need that to set up because it's wet. If we try to do a lower element down here, let's say more in blue, base of the trees to make it darker, it'll run up to where the paper is dry here. Now it'll stop. So it creates its own line there. So in this case, it's going to run up to the paper where it's dried out. And that'll stop up to that point. Up to about there. And now we've got a little bit, if we do, it'd be nice to even have a thinner point, but we don't right now. But if you could get even finer one for this type of detail, is to bring those lines down. It almost works like a pen then, once you come right to the point of a very fine, and bring those trees to the ground. And that kind of gives some feature to it. Maybe give the person a bluish green coat, some jeans down there, and a cast shadow coming off the person as well. Then if we like coming back just to finish it really quickly, because you can see how fast this is moving now, what the charm of watercolor could be in terms of speed. We'll come back to the original blue shadow area and now come back to our first corner to make sure that's stronger. And as it goes to the back where the tree is dark, it'll actually be the same side elevation, but it'll be brighter in the distance than it appears right here because you want to pop that corner out. So those are the basics that we'll work through, and obviously we'll expand the language of watercolor as the drawings become more intricate with the design that we work with. But basically you can probably be best served before you actually crack into drawing number 1 at the Martin House to just try a blank sheet of paper and do some dry on dry, dry on wet, wet on dry, wet on wet, wet on wet, and mix some colors and blend them together so you get a head start knowing what you sort of find that works in terms of the language of the architecture and what you want to draw. And then historically, then I will actually let an older drawing sit and kind of condense here so I have sort of a visual memory of what I mixed before if I liked it. So you sometimes keep an old drawing's remnants, so it gives you a starter point what you want to mix again because you liked how it turned out. It's also a good habit always before you actually come to the master work to have a second sheet of paper just off the page to the right so that you can trial your mix, because what you see here might be a little bit different than actually how it reads on the paper itself. So whatever you do here, don't go straight to the paper, go over here. And also never go straight from a pad in because you'll find it's probably too brilliant for an architectural type of sketch. So that's our introduction here. Come prepared with your brushes, your water, your cups, your set of colors you're going to work with, and your paper stock, 140 cold press. So it's a nice smooth finish here. And we should be ready to go and march our way through the modern masters in watercolor.